a professora Anne Rathbone Bradley, é economista, PhD em Economia pela George Mason University, é vice-presidente de Iniciativas Econômicas do Instituto para a Fé, Trabalho e Economia, onde desenvolve e coordena pesquisas direcionadas à teologia bíblica da liberdade econômica. Atualmente, ela é professora visitante da Universidade de Georgetown e leciona também no Instituto para a Política Mundial e na George Mason University. Adicionalmente, é professora no Bernard Center para Mulheres, Ciência Política e Política Pública. Anteriormente, ela lecionou na Charles University, em Praga, e foi diretora associada do programa em Economia, Ciência Política e Direito no James Buchanan Center da George Mason University. Ela é editora e autora de um dos capítulos do livro For the Least of These, A Biblical Answer to Poverty. No respectivo capítulo, ela trata da desigualdade de renda sob as perspectivas econômicas e bíblicas, discutindo como pessoas com fé cristã devem agir com relação a essa questão, tendo em vista suas vocações. Os trabalhos acadêmicos anteriores da doutora Anne tinham como foco a economia política do terrorismo, com ênfase específica na organização industrial da Al-Qaeda. Esses trabalhos tiveram grande repercussão acadêmica em periódicos e livros. Atualmente, ela está escrevendo um livro sobre a economia política da Al-Qaeda depois do 11 de setembro. Por conta dessa última linha de pesquisa acadêmica, ela foi convidada a trabalhar na Agência Central de Inteligência do Governo dos Estados Unidos como analista econômica do Escritório de Análise do Terrorismo da mesma instituição onde atuou por alguns anos.
Thank you so much for having me here. It is an honor, and I actually just flew in this morning from Washington, D.C., so I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm honored to have been asked to talk about ideas that are so crucial to the future of the world. And as Christians, we are uniquely poised to change the world, to be advocates for the poor, for the marginalized, but for freedom, which I believe very much is what God intended for us. And so what I want to do in the time we have tonight is to build a foundation, a framework for us to think about the world and our place in it. And as Christians, we must start with Scripture. There's no other place to start. And at my institute, I work with theologians day in and day out, so they've taught me a lot how to start first with sound theology and build upon that the important framework of the economic way of thinking. And combined, they provide a very powerful way to think about the world. So that's what I'm going to do in our time together. And as you see, I've tried to title this the Christian Origins of Faith, Work, and Economics. That sounds like a lot to do in an hour, which it is. But I'm gonna do my best. And what I want to start with are these three ideas of creation. So to understand who we are and our place in the world, we have to go to our creation and that story in Genesis. And then we're going to learn a little bit more from that story about what we are to do. And I would tell you what's very exciting about reading Genesis again, which I'm sure you've read it before, is that it tells you a lot, not just about the creation story and on what day what thing was created, but it tells you how to live your life in 2017. It is a message for each of us about our purpose and our place in God's creation. And who would not want to know that information? I think we all yearn to understand our purpose and how to fulfill that purpose. So we're going to do that. And then I'm going to layer in the economic way of thinking and then end with economic freedom. So economic freedom is the type of society that we must live in if we are to live into who God created us to be. So that's kind of what we're going to do tonight. And I have kind of three big points that I want to walk us through. One, the first question we're going to ask together is, what are God's design of his creation and what are his desires for that creation? That is so important for us to start with and to understand. Number two, what principles can be found in creation that inform how we should live today? Like I said, Genesis is relevant for your life in the 21st century. And then how does the call to work, I'm going to make the claim that we were always created to work. How does that call to work require good economic thinking and then a society that's characterized by economic freedom? I want to take you to this picture that I have behind the slide. It's a puzzle. I don't know if you do puzzles or if you maybe did puzzles when you were younger. But I want you to keep the image of a puzzle in the back of your mind as we talk tonight. Because when you think about puzzles, they're actually very easy, aren't they? You go to the store, you get the puzzle, you lay the pieces out on the table, and you look at the box, and the box tells you what you're supposed to do. There's never a question with a puzzle. You always know what you're headed towards. Wouldn't it be nice if life was a puzzle, where we always knew day in and day out what we were headed towards? That is not the case. We don't know what the end of today is supposed to look like for us when we wake up in the morning, and we don't know what the end of our lives are supposed to look like. So we have to look up, we have to look to Christ, and we have to be grounded in the Scriptures, because there's a lot of uncertainty in living out our God-given call to work in our creation. So I want you to keep thinking about that puzzle. But I want to start first with God's purposes in creation. There's a lot in here. I'm taking you back to Genesis 1, verses 26 through 28, and I will read it. It says, "Then God said, 'Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground.'" That we're made in God's image. This notion of being made in God's image comes up again in the next verse. "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Man and woman he created them." So it's repeated over and over again. We are made in God's image and his likeness. And that carries with it very big responsibilities for our lives and what we're to do. Verse 28 says, "God blessed them and said to them, 'Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground.'" Now you'll note here that this is not just about multiplying. It's about being fruitful and multiplying. So what does that mean for us? Well, certainly it means that we are part of families, that we have families, that we grow in communities together with our church families and our neighbors and our relatives. But what does it mean to be fruitful? That's a big question. It means we're supposed to bear our fruit, the fruit that we were given. I also want to take you to the yellow highlighted word here. I did this on purpose. I fill the earth. I highlighted that in yellow. It doesn't say fill the garden. We were created and born into the garden, but we were always supposed to fill the earth. So we get our mandate right in the first chapter of Genesis. We're supposed to be fruitful and multiply and fill the whole earth in that process. These are big responsibilities, and not one of us can do it on our own. Not one of us. So we need each other. So we're going to have to start this conversation as it goes along to think about what does community look like. Now I want to take you to the second chapter of Genesis. This is Genesis 2:15. The verse reads, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to take care of it." Those are two separate phrases in the original Hebrew, to work it and to take care of it. So you might think of an example where maybe you've watched somebody's house when they were out of town. You took care of their house, and maybe you brought the mail in and fed the dog and watered the plants or something like this. You took care of it, right? You preserved it. You made sure that nothing bad happened to it. And then maybe if something bad happened to it, then you called for help. That's taking care of something. Working something implies much more. Working it, and I have the original Hebrew here, you see it on the screen, is the word abad. And abad means to serve. So we are supposed to serve God's creation and take care of it. Those are, again, two distinct ideas. We're not supposed to stand over God's creation and make sure nothing ever moves. That wasn't our request or commandment in Genesis. We are supposed to not plunder the creation, but in the process of that, we are also supposed to create, to serve, to work it. And every single one of us does that in our own unique way. Not all of us are going to do it the same, and I'm going to get into that in a minute. So what's the point? Why are we doing all of this? What is the purpose? Remember, God gives us these commandments before the fall. So this is before sin enters the world. The call is very clear that we're to work, be fruitful, cultivate, create, as image bearers, as people who are imago Dei, made in the image of God. For what purpose? For the purpose of flourishing. Now, when we see this word in Scripture, we tend to see the word shalom, and most often shalom is translated as peace. And I think that from a theological perspective, is a very shallow or weak definition of shalom. Shalom, well, let me take a step back. Peace means the absence of conflict, right? It means that we're not stealing each other's things or beating each other over the head. That's the absence of conflict. Shalom is a much richer and deeper and more profound concept. It means things work the way they're supposed to work, the way God intended them to work before the fall. So see, the claim that I'm making here is that before the fall, God asked us to be fruitful, to multiply, to be creative, to cultivate. The fall happens. The only thing that changes is the difficulty. The fall does not negate the first two chapters of Genesis. It doesn't undo it. We are still to create, to cultivate, to take care, to abide, to serve. But now it's going to be a lot more difficult because of our sin and the sin of everyone around us. But we're still here to bring about greater levels of shalom, human flourishing. Jonathan Pennington is an American theologian, and he writes a very large paper on the concept of biblical flourishing. And this is just a very short excerpt from that. He says that flourishing is characterized by human health, wholeness, resulting in strength, fertility, and longevity. The vision of shalom is at the core of God's redeeming work. It's at the core of God's redeeming work. So we are here along that journey by using our creative gifts and talents to cultivate the earth, to serve it, and in doing so, we're able to bring about greater levels of human flourishing, not just for us, but for everybody around us. Flourishing is mutual. Flourishing isn't exploitative. Flourishing happens when we serve and can be served. So this is a really large concept. And what I want you to think about is some of the words that you see here: fertility, longevity, health. We can't flourish if we're poor. Well, let me take that back. We can't flourish as much as God desires for us to flourish when we are poor and suffering. Look at the words here: longevity. Right now, according to a recent Nobel Prize winner, Angus Deaton, he projects that a female born in 2015 in the United States has a 50-50 chance of living to 100 years old. That's profound. We've never been able to say that before. That's part of longevity. And the longer you're here, the more service you get to do in God's purposes. So I want you to start thinking about the material society, the societal conditions that we have to live in for this stuff to be able to happen. There's some profound implications for the ordering of our social and political and legal affairs. Now, I want to continue in Scripture a little bit before I get into some of the more kind of economic ways of thinking here as I'm kind of layering these together. And I take you to Jeremiah 29:7, which I think is a great example of what, again, post-fall, the fall has already happened, what God is asking of his people. And if you remember this verse, I will say to you, it is, seek the peace and the prosperity of the city to which I have carried you, for if it prospers, you prosper. This is a letter from Jeremiah, okay, to the exiles. Can you imagine being an exile and being told to prosper, to build families, to be fruitful, to build cities? This is the order that's given. And note the end of the verse, if it prospers, you prosper, meaning that prosperity, flourishing is mutual. If we want the cities that we live in to flourish, we need to be flourishing ourselves. And vice versa. If we want to flourish, we need to be in thriving cities. So this verse helps us understand that flourishing is not just about me and my life. It's about the entire community that I find myself in. And really, I think what's at the core of this idea of flourishing, this idea of prosperity, I'm going to introduce an economics term here, is profits. And I want you in your head to translate the word profit. This is a word economists use all the time. But at least in American culture right now, profit is very much looked down upon. It's not always very popular if you're a billionaire who has a lot of money from their company. Profits are about leftovers. That's the translation I want you to use in your mind. When you profit, it means you have leftovers. Leftover time, leftover energy, leftover talent, leftover money. It's not just about money. It's not only financial. It's about all the things you have to give. And your most precious asset is your time, because you don't know how long you have. And every moment needs to count, according to the scriptures that we're seeing here. Every moment is meaningful in God's redemptive purposes. So we are supposed to seek profits, that is, leftovers. Now, the question is going to be, how do we do that? Right? Are we exploiting and hurting other people to profit, or are we serving them to profit? There's a big difference, right? So that's what I want to talk about. Now, I would tell you that I went to George Mason University to study economics, so the way that we think about economics, I think, is the right way. I'm biased, I suppose, but you cannot talk about economics without first talking about the human person. You can't. And if you are talking about economics without talking about the human person, you're doing it wrong. Because economics is about how human beings make decisions under conditions of scarcity, and that's what we're doing all the time. And so I want to start here with a little bit of human anthropology. What is true? What is the nature of man that is so true it is irreducible? Because that's where we have to start. We have to recognize who we are. I've just set forth what God wants us to do. Now we have to know who we are, and then we're going to get a better picture of what do we require. What do we need to do our jobs well? And I think the first characteristic of human anthropology that we must take into account, and frankly, without a biblical worldview, I don't know how you get to this, but that's probably a different conversation for a different day, is that we're unique. Not only are we unique, but we have dignity. Just in our creation. The person who created us is the one who bestows dignity upon us in that creation. And we are unique. So I have the picture of the snowflake here. Scientists have researched snowflakes, and they've never found two that are exactly the same. And that's a little bit of a metaphor, I suppose, for us. All right? We all bear a lot of similarities in the way we look, the way we live our lives, but we're all very unique. And so in that call in Genesis that you're to work the garden and take care of it, your uniqueness means that you can only do it the way God has enabled you to do it. And that's going to be different from how other people do it. I think it's very empowering and inspiring to understand this concept, because it means that there's never been another you on the entire planet, and there never will be. So you have profound importance in God's created order, and you have an important job to do. This is an economic term, But it's part of our human anthropology, that is that we value different things. We value things subjectively. The silly, simple example would be some people like pizza with pepperonis on it, and some people like pizza with no pepperonis on it, and some people don't like pizza at all. We all like things differently. And it is comes from our uniqueness. It comes from our preferences. Our likes and our dislikes drive our economic choices. Some of those things we can't even control, right? If you don't like cheese or pepperoni, it might be just the way you're made. And so the way that we're created is going to drive our preferences, and that's going to drive our economic choices. So, again, we have to start with who are we? And it's important to recognize that we all don't desire the same things. That's a really important thing to recognize in the policy world, because we often ask our governments to provide things for us. And if we value things subjectively, then we're asking a third party to know what our preferences are and to deliver them accordingly. It's difficult. It's not to say we should never do that. It's just difficult. And we only get that when we understand kind of who humans are. We're intentional. God created us to do. We are always in motion. We are always trying to improve our current state of affairs. We are in motion. We are active people, not passive people. So we're intentional. Now, we're flawed and we're sinners, so this doesn't always work out exactly like it's supposed to. But it does mean that we were created to create. We were created to be in motion, not to sit idly by, which we already heard in some of the opening remarks. And finally, we're profit seekers. I have a picture of a clock here, because again, I think that you should reorient your thinking of profit to include time, not just money. We love it when there's not a lot of traffic when we are driving in our car, right? Because that means more time left over for us. Or it's nice when you're studying for an exam and you study, say for 3 hours and you feel like you really understand the material instead of the 6 hours you thought you were going to have to study, right? That's leftover. So we're always seeking profit. The question here is, what lengths are we willing to go to get the profit? Are we willing to steal, to cheat, to lie, and to hurt other people in our quest for profit? And how, when we live amongst each other, if there are people who don't view the world the way we do, how do we keep them from doing that? So see, the beauty of economics is that it takes people as who they are rather than as people we want them to be. Perfect people, people with full understanding and full knowledge who never make mistakes. We can't get that. That's an impossibility. So good economic thinking has to embrace the human person as they are and then try to ask questions about what that person needs so that we can get on the road to flourishing. Now, I'm an economist, so I have to, every time I give a talk, put a picture of Adam Smith on the PowerPoint slide. I hope that's okay. But Adam Smith understood this idea very well about human beings. He said that it's our self-interest, the looking out for how do we improve our own conditions, that if we recognize that and understand that that means we're going to need good institutions, then it can actually be the case that strangers will wake up in the morning and live amongst each other and think about ways to serve each other. That's very profound in human history. Most of human history has not been a story of humans serving strangers. That's not been the story. The story has been people living short lives that were very hard and oppressive. So Adam Smith's insights are very important to understand here because they are based on, I think, part of the biblical view of the human person that he seemed to see, that individual ambition can be oriented to concern for other people. And again, the big question is, well, how does all that happen? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So I want to get into kind of very specifically talking about economics now. And I know not, everybody here has probably different levels of economics background and classes, so I'm just starting from the beginning. But one of the jokes that I always like to tell is that if I'm at a cocktail party and somebody finds out that I'm an economist, people run away from you. They just go to the other side of the room because they assume that economists are boring. We talk about gross domestic product and trade deficits, and nobody really is that interested in that, especially at a cocktail party, right? That's not very exciting. And then I always like to ask a question, which is, in the last 6 months, have you ever had a night where you couldn't sleep well? And you were tossing and you were turning and you just couldn't get to sleep? Raise your hand. Yeah, that happens to all of us, right? We have these nights where we can't sleep. Okay. How many people had a night where you couldn't sleep and you're tossing and you're turning and you just can't get to sleep, and it was because gross domestic product didn't grow as fast as you wanted it to in the last quarter? This happens to almost no one. I'm an economist. I don't lose sleep over this. And I think this is why in some ways, we need to rethink the way we teach economics. We need to rethink the way we talk about it. Because, yes, economists should talk about gross domestic product, but that's not where we start. We start with who is the person? Who are the people we're talking about? What do they need? What are they after? What are their constraints? So this is what Merriam-Webster, the famous dictionary, when I just had to look this up because I wanted to understand, well, how does the world view economics? And this is what Merriam-Webster has to say. It's a social science concerned chiefly with the description and the analysis of the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. Doesn't sound very exciting, right? Who's asleep? This is not something that gets non-economists excited to talk about the subject. And I think it's because it sounds very aggregate, right? It sounds like something that smart people figure out, how many rolls of paper are going to be made in an economy in a year and how many cars we're going to make, and that sounds like it's out of our hands. And so here's how I want us to think about economics. We are profit seekers who attempt to maximize value under conditions of uncertainty while minimizing the costs. That is the process of economics. That is what economists study. They study how do people in different societies make decisions, and our presumption is always that they're maximizing their value and trying to minimize their costs. Now notice, I put the picture of the puzzle up here again. And I think that's really important because if we assume that economies are puzzles that need to be solved by experts, and we put experts in charge of economies, we run into a lot of problems. And history demonstrates this to be the case. The Soviet Union being one of the most extreme examples of an economy run by smart technocrats. And under those conditions, people starved. People were abused and oppressed. So when we get our economics wrong, we're going to get our politics wrong, and we're going to get farther away from flourishing instead of closer to it. And I think we have a biblical obligation to get closer to flourishing. So let's talk about kind of some of these economic realities. I think it's important to put it in these terms. Economics poses realities in our lives that are the same as the realities of physics, right? We don't debate gravity. It just is. It's part of our lives. You don't have to know the equation for it. You don't have to have a PhD in physics to understand that it's part of your constraints. And economics is the same way. And here are some of those realities that we need to reconcile ourselves with. One is that we cannot create something ex nihilo. We can't create something out of nothing. God can create and did create something out of nothing, right? But we are imago Dei. We are made in the image of God, so we can create something out of something. That's what we're asked to do. But we cannot create something out of nothing. Now, this sounds maybe very obvious. Why am I bringing it up? Because what it implies is that there's costs every time we engage in an action. There's this kind of acronym up here that you might have learned if you took Econ 101. There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. This is a very famous saying by economists. We love to hear the word free. I think we love to hear the word free because we know free isn't really true. So it's kind of like a dream, coming true. There is no such thing as a free lunch. We can't create something out of nothing. We can create something out of something, but we have to realize that we live in a world of scarcity. We are limited. We have limited gifts and abilities and talents. Economists talk about this idea as a comparative advantage, meaning we're relatively good at a few things, and we're not very good at doing most of the things that we need, not only to survive, but to thrive. Imagine what life would look like if you were left to your own devices to produce everything you need to live your life. You would have almost nothing. This is true of all of us. So we are limited. And it's this fact that we're limited that propels us into trade with one another. Because now when we have the possibility of trade, then we can come together. And I can specialize in economics. And I don't have to make my own clothes in the morning. And I don't have to make my own cereal. And I don't have to make my own car. I can buy those things from other people. And when I'm able to do that, my time is freed up. I have more profit, thus more time to dedicate to God's purposes. Another economic reality here is we live in a world of scarce resources that have multiple and competing ends. So every single decision that we engage in imposes a cost upon us. Being here in this room right now means you're not doing something else. Even if you didn't pay money to do something, you gave your time. And so you want to be very careful about how you allocate that scarce resource of your time. And what you need to know more importantly is that once you use your time to do something, that time is gone. You can't reclaim it. And so what I'm trying to draw out here in economics is that it's an idea that's very biblically relevant to us, which is stewardship. In fact, if you look at the word stewardship in the Greek, it's oikonomia, which means to manage a household. That's what you're doing when you're thinking like an economist. You're managing what's closest to you, and you're trying to use prudent and wise judgments around your assets. Why? So that you can grow them. But you can't do that if you don't recognize these realities. So every decision you make brings a cost. You pay a price for everything you choose to do because of the fact that we live in a scarce world with scarce resources. I have two more of these realities I want to talk about, then we'll talk about economic freedom. People respond to incentives. And this is, I think sometimes a hard one for us to recognize. This is a picture of a Walmart. And Walmart is the world's largest grocer or provider of food items, the world's largest grocer. And do you know why they're the world's largest grocer? Because of their mission statement, which is save money, live better. I've looked at Walmart's mission statements for the past 20 years. It doesn't really change very much. It's always about saving money or offering the lowest price to people. Now, I would ask you to ask yourselves a question. Why do the executives at Walmart wake up in the morning and think about or care about how much people pay for groceries? Is it just because they're really nice? Do they have a sense of benevolence and altruism? Maybe. I don't know them, so I can't really say. It's possible. But this doesn't really explain billions in dollars and decades of them doing this. They're investing billions of their own dollars in trying to figure out how to give customers low prices. Why would they do that? Because we come back as customers if they can offer us lower prices on the things we need and want, like shampoo and toothpaste and toothbrushes and laundry detergent and all those things. And when we can rely on other people to provide those things for us, then we aren't stuck doing it. Things that we might not be very good at doing. I would never leave the house if I had to make my own shampoo. I don't know how to do that. I am freed up because other people figure out how to do it for me. And then I can engage in trade. But that only happens when people have the right incentives. And in a market economy, what we understand are the incentives are prices and profits and losses. Prices and profits and losses. So the profit and loss is a very powerful set of incentives that's sent by customers to people like Walmart that tells them what to do. And it gets the billionaires at Walmart to in some way care about me. That seems phenomenal to me. And I don't know about you, but I want to live in a world where strangers are thinking about how to anticipate and solve my needs. And not just things that might seem silly that you can live without, like shampoo. But what about curing cancer? What about inventing the pacemaker? What about open heart surgery the first time it occurred? These things save lives. And again, if we're left to our own devices, we can't do it. We need each other. That's the story of how God created us. He created us to need each other. And He desires us to find multiple ways to come into community with one another. And trading is one of those ways, not the only way. But economics, through markets, brings people together, strangers together, in fact. And then finally, what markets do is they help, and F.A. Hayek was the economist who really understood this extremely well, was that markets helped collect knowledge or information that exists in little bits and pieces across all of us. So we all know different things. We all have access to different types of knowledge and different types of information. And there's no way to get all of it to be collected in one place. There's no supercomputer, if you will, that can do that. Not yet. And so we need a mechanism in society that allows people to communicate with one another and share this knowledge. And for Hayek, what he understood, by the way, he won the Nobel Prize for this insight, which is that it's prices that do that. Prices are emergent, meaning they are organic, they spring up out of economic activity. They are not designed, they are not imposed, they are not thought up by smart technocrats. Now, we can do that. Again, I take you to the Soviet Union. This is an economy where we did not rely on emergent prices, but where we hired PhD economists to sit in a bureau and figure out what the prices of things should be. And it failed because even smart economists with lots of PhDs do not know what the price of a car should be in 2025. There's no way to have that knowledge. So we need to find mechanisms because we're fallible. We can't know everything. And so this means that institutions, the institutions we live in, the institutions that emerge from our interactions with each other, and the institutions that we design matter so much. Legal institutions and political institutions matter greatly. If we have political institutions that allow people to open businesses, to live out their calling to work, then prices and profits and losses are going to emerge, and they're going to direct those entrepreneurs in ways that we could never know before. And that's the amazing thing. We also need, I have a picture of a handshake up here, because some of the most important institutions that regulate our behavior and govern and restrain us are informal institutions, customs, norms, values, and beliefs. This is where Scripture is absolutely necessary if we want to have a world with greater flourishing. Because Scripture tells us what we need to know, that we have a responsibility to the world to live out our call to work, that we have a responsibility to protect property rights. Look at the 10 Commandments. Property rights are mentioned more than one time. That we have a responsibility to live in community with one another. And so the values and the attitudes and the beliefs that people have about who they are, what they should be, and what they should be striving for matter so deeply. So I think really the world right now is engaged in a battle of ideas. I don't think the battle of ideas is new, but I think it's still very important. And we can have a place in that battle by advocating for the right things, which is a society where we can serve each other, where we can elevate the poor by just living out our biblical call to work. So when all these things work as they should, we go from mere survival to greater levels of flourishing. We won't have perfect flourishing until Christ returns. That's not possible for us. But we can have more than there would have been before if we do what we're supposed to do. But this requires a lot, as I've said. And so I want to end with this idea that it really requires economic freedom. And economic freedom is about letting people trade with each other. It's about letting people decide where they want to go to college, what they want to major in, what business they want to pursue. That's what it means to have economic freedom. And when you have economic freedom, you have a greater number of trading partners. And this frees you up. So my own research on economic freedom has taken me to think about women, particularly women who live in sub-Saharan Africa and the developing world, the poorest countries on the planet. And I want to just take you through a little, very small example of what life is like for my female counterpart in a place like the Democratic Republic of the Congo today. And this is what her life looks like. She has to go and collect water for her family. And she uses a dirty jug, and she walks with her children in tow, mostly her female children who are left out of educational opportunities because she can't do it by herself. She needs help. And she collects the water. Sometimes she's walking 4 miles. In many cases, it's 40, 50 pounds, and she's carrying it back to her village or to her hut. And then she's finding a very crude way to purify this water. And then she drinks it, and her family drinks it. And she has to do this every single day, day in and day out, because if she doesn't, her family's not going to survive. The problem with this scenario, as economists understand it, by the way, is that this is a woman who's probably living on less than $2 a day. And what the data tell us is that she runs out of calories each day before she runs out of income. Because doing this probably takes 3,000 to 4,000 calories every day. So not only does it take hours and hours, it takes all of her caloric expenditure, and she's not left with much else. This is how people who have a lot of economic freedom get water. You go to the grocery store and you pick out a pallet of bottles, and they're clean and they're just waiting for you. And you put them in your car or put them on your bike and you go home and you drink it. A pallet of water like this near my house is probably like $4 US. I have a grocery store that's about a quarter of a mile from my house. So this whole episode takes me about 15 minutes, and it probably costs me 100 calories. So I have lots of leftovers. If this is the way you get water, you have lots of leftovers. Time to pursue school, education, family, friends, hobbies, all the things you like to do. So it's not that the people who are living in the poorest parts of the planet can't flourish at all. If they're living each day trusting in God, He's going to honor that. But what we desire for them is to be able to have more trading partners so they can get water like we get water. And that's only going to happen if they have greater levels of economic freedom. Now, what I want to talk about here is that economic freedom is on the rise, and there's real reasons historically to be optimistic about the future, although we have problems we have to solve. So I would say cautiously optimistic is where we should head. This is a graph that shows world GDP. So it's a measure of income or wealth. And if you look at the yellow line, that's the trend. And it shows you world GDP. So this is every country averaged together. And this is from AD 1. We didn't have, data collection methods then, so these are back-of-the-envelope calculations, AD1 to today. And I want you to look at the yellow graph. Most humans, for most of human history, have lived on less than $100 a year. And they have lived very short lives. It is not until 1900 that this graph crosses $1,000 per year, 1900. And then it kind of goes crazy. Economists call this the hockey stick graph. And many economists say we're living in the handle of the hockey stick. Remember, this is world GDP. Every country is calculated in there. So for a long time in human history, we had very, very little income. And when we had very little income, we didn't have a lot of longevity, we didn't have a lot of health, fertility was hurt. So again, this is just part of shalom. Material prosperity is not all of shalom, but it is certainly part of it. And we need to advocate for that. It is very, very hard to unleash your human creativity on the planet when you're struggling every day just to get water. And so this is what I think we want to change in the world, but we need to know how. I'll tell you this, too. That GDP growth is happening all the while population growth is increasing. So just in the post-World War II era, since 1960, world population has doubled. That's a lot. World GDP has quintupled. So it's multiplied by a factor of 5, which is exactly why you see that hockey stick graph. So I would tell you that it's possible, right, when things work the way God desires them to work. This is not perfect. We get more longevity and more prosperity. Remember what we learned from Jeremiah. If it prospers, you prosper. We have to prosper together. We can't prosper apart. So how do we do this? I'm going to skip this graph. We need economic freedom. We have to have economic freedom. Economic freedom is something that economists have dedicated a lot of time trying to measure. Milton Friedman, in fact, kind of came up with this measurement. He said, we talk a lot about prosperity. How do we measure it? And so in the 70s, they came up with an economic freedom index, and they measure several things. And this is just kind of a big overview here that I want to give you. One is the soundness of a currency. So if an economy is engaging in inflationary practices, that robs people of their money. And it makes it hard for them to take care of themselves and their families and to make investments in the future. So soundness of money is one of the aspects of economic freedom that we measure. Freedom to trade. So does a society allow international trade? Does it limit international trade? Remember, the lesson of economics is that, and the lesson of human anthropology is that we are very limited. We cannot do this stuff on our own. And so we need trading partners. We need to come together in a community of strangers and serve each other. And so the only way that that can be facilitated is if we have lots of trade. The regulations in an economy, so when we measure economic freedom, we look at the level of regulations, meaning how hard is it to open a business? How hard is it to maintain a business? Are there lots of licenses and permits and fees that you have to acquire to open that business? And that hurts people, because, especially the poor, right? If you don't have a lot of capital and you have to pay a lot of regulations to open your business, then it's going to hurt entrepreneurship. Property rights. We measure in this index whether an economy protects property rights through the rule of law and an independent court system. Is it easy to buy and sell property? Things like this. And then the size of government. And this is really key here, and I want to emphasize this because it might sound ideological to you, but it's not, and here's why. Government is constrained in the way any other institution is constrained because it needs to get its resources from something else. And so to operate, to function, a government has very limited ways to get its resources. It can tax, it can borrow, it can inflate. Some of those are way better than others. But really, a thriving government has to have a thriving economy on which it draws its resources. So when we measure this, what we see is that when a society's government grows ever bigger, it starts swamping or taking over or crushing private sector activity. This is exactly what is happening in Venezuela today. An economy that every single day, what you're seeing in the news is you're seeing a government that's out of control because the economy is out of control. And so every day the government takes another step to try to control an out-of-control economy. Minimum wage increases, limits on energy use, all these types of things. It's an act of pure desperation, in addition to inflating the currency. It doesn't work, because if you don't have the sound institutions of trade and property rights, then ordinary people cannot do what God has asked them to do. They can't live into who God has asked them to do and who he wants them to be if they are suffering under this type of oppression. And as that government chaos escalates, you tend to see governments take over more and more and more economic activity, which ultimately ends up destroying the economy. This is economic freedom around the world. The red countries are least free. The blue countries are most free, and then there's kind of countries that are a mix in between. Orange is less free, yellow is kind of free. So the thing about this map is that it shows me that there's a lot of work we have to do, but it also gives me hope that there's a lot of progress that we have made. Think of the hockey stick graph. 150 years ago, most people were poor. In 1820, 94% of the planet lived in abject poverty, meaning under $2 a day. 1820 was not that long ago. Now you have a country like Luxembourg, which has the highest GDP per capita in the world. It's about $82,000. So there's real hope. The president of the World Bank is saying today in public, out loud, on the record, that we are going to eliminate abject poverty from the planet. It will go down to 3% of the planet by 2030. It's been cut in half since 1990. So there's real reason to be optimistic about the future, but we have to do it right. There's a right way to do this and a wrong way to do this. Economic freedom is the right way. Economic freedom, to me, lines up most precisely with the biblical call to work and to serve. I want to end, I'm an economist, I have too many graphs. I won't go over all of them. But I want to end with a story, because I think stories are the way that we convey these ideas and have a lot of impacts. Does anybody know who this is a picture of? Yeah, I heard it. Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin took over the former Soviet Union, and he went to Houston, Texas in 1991 to visit then President George Bush on a diplomatic mission. And this is a picture from that visit. This is one of my favorite stories. You can Google it as well. This is all documented on the internet and elsewhere. So Boris Yeltsin is in a NASA research lab. And you know, that's what dignitaries do when they go to each other's countries, right? They say, look at all the wonderful things we're doing to put people into space. Aren't we wonderful? And Boris Yeltsin is very uninterested in this whole space stuff. And he says, I want to go to a grocery store. And I can only imagine the diplomatic panic that set in when you have, the president of one of the, biggest countries in the world saying, I'd like to go on an unscheduled trip to the grocery store, please. And that's exactly what they did. They took him to a place called Ralph's grocery store in Houston, Texas on a Tuesday. This is a picture from that visit. Boris Yeltsin, if you're interested, he is in the ice cream and popsicle aisle, which might be why he's so excited Ice cream and popsicles, I think, are quite exciting. But look at his amazement. He can't believe what he sees. He can't believe that it's possible for ordinary, non-important, non-political people to have the luxury of pushing around a grocery cart and not think that much of it. Nobody was excited, nobody was shouting and screaming, and nobody was fighting over the last loaf of bread. He said that this experience both overwhelmed him and depressed him. He went up and found the manager of the grocery store and said to him, "Do you have to have a special education to manage a grocery store?" Because, see, the thing is, that was the Soviet mentality, is that if you want lots of foodstuffs in one building with all these different prices, you need to have, a PhD in that. You need to be really smart, because only technocrats can do that. He said, do you have a special education? And he said, "No, I don't." He then was later overheard to say, "If the Russian people heard of this, surely they would revolt," which I think is what he found depressing. Surely they would revolt. And you know why? Because it was unnecessary for the Soviet Union to be poor and starving. It was unnecessary. It didn't have to be. We knew how to make grocery stores. But the problem is, if the government and legal institutions don't let the market work, the market was just made up of ordinary people like you and me trying to pursue their dreams. If the government stops us from doing that, then it's going to limit the amount of flourishing that everybody experiences. It's going to dampen the human spirit. It's going to dampen the spirit of creativity, of imago Dei. Boris Yeltsin finally understood that. He actually wrote about this in his autobiography and said it changed his entire view of how to run an economy. Can you imagine? Just by going to a grocery store, it changed his entire view of how to run an economy. The answer is economic freedom. When we don't have economic freedom, we cannot live into our gifts. We cannot serve others. We cannot cultivate the earth. Here's a newspaper article from this week, and it's a picture of a grocery store. So this is a grocery store in 1991 in Texas, Houston, Texas. This is a picture of people standing in line to get into a grocery store in Caracas, Venezuela, in 2017. They have ration tickets. They're told what day to go. And this is what they find when they get in there: empty shelves. And so they have to go and find bread, oil, meat, cheese on the black market. We can destroy economies or we can lift them up. And when we're lifting an economy up, what we're really doing is allowing people to do what God has asked them to do, to live into their purpose. So I want you to walk away thinking of a couple of things. One, there should be absolute reason for you to have hope and optimism and courage about the future. There is good reason to be hopeful. But we can mess it up. So we need to be very clear on what governments can do and what people can do. We need to be very clear on advocating for the right things. And I put forth to you tonight that the right thing to advocate for is economic freedom, because it allows us to be who God created us to be. Thank you so much.
Bem, a parte final, e que pode ser bem interessante, são as perguntas. O número de perguntas é bem grande, nós não vamos conseguir cobrir todas elas, mas vamos tentar. So, I'll give you the questions, and those that you want to just hit as a ball, you answer quickly. We have too many for the evening,
Okay.
but I'll give you some. A primeira pergunta é: I don't think you need a translation, no.
Okay, I
Oh.
can't hear it.
A primeira pergunta é se o shalom só pode ser alcançado, se esse shalom que ela falou é algo que é exclusivo para o cristianismo. So the first question is whether this shalom as the ideal is something that can only be achieved from a Christian perspective.
Oh, that's a great question. Can you guys hear me? Is this on? Okay. I think that's a wonderful question. And my sense of it, although I'm not a theologian, is that shalom is a uniquely biblical perspective, idea, can only come about because God designed his creation that way. So I think it comes from God, for certain. I think it applies to Judeo-Christian faith and background, but I don't think that that excludes non-Christians from participating and benefiting from shalom. So think about, a society where people are helping each other and serving each other and loving each other through communities and nonprofits and for-profits. I think that anybody can be a participant in that, but I do think it's a uniquely biblical idea.
The next question. Em sua opinião, poderíamos então resolver problemas do mundo baseados na Bíblia? Is it really your opinion then that we would solve world problems based upon the Bible?
Yes, 100%. I believe that God designed and created the world. I think that's the unique Christian perspective. And so let me qualify it just a little bit. Are we enabled through Scripture to do what God has asked us to do? Yes. When we do that, can we bring about greater levels of flourishing? Yes. But we alone, as fallen sinners on the earth, we can't perfect the world. So the return of Christ will make all things new, and we'll have the new heaven and the new earth, and that will be an entirely different, kind of arrangement, if you will. So, but yeah, I do think that the Scripture gives us everything we need, but we on our own don't have the ability to do it all.
Okay. It's interesting that Christianity provides the only structure that says that grace, God's own activity, can be at the same time special. There's something called special grace for theology, but there's also something called general grace, which is available to anyone, indistinct in terms of religion. They serve different purposes, but it would seem to me that shalom would be a purpose that would be strongly impacted by common grace.
Common grace, yeah.
Could you comment on that?
Yeah, so I think this idea of common grace is really important because it suggests, I think it goes back to this being made in the image of God, which is that all of us are made in the image of God, whether we believe in Him or not, whether, what our faith walk looks like. So we can participate, and common grace is then extended to everyone. So yeah, I absolutely think that that's true. And to me, that's why to have economic freedom, you don't have to have a society where everyone is a Christian. We're not going to get that. We're not going to get a society where every single person says, I believe. But I think economic freedom through, and common grace, these types of ideas work in spite of that.
It would be interesting if we had the time to go on to talk about religious freedom and economic freedom and their binding.
I'm writing a paper on that, so when it's done, we can
Wonderful.
talk.
This question is more technical, directly with our situation here in Brazil. I'll go in Portuguese first and then go to English. O que é que nós, como empreendedores, podemos fazer para melhorar a nossa situação em termos de liberdade econômica num país com regulamentação massiva, impostos massivos, e isso sem mencionar os problemas sérios de gestão da coisa pública pelo governo. What can we, as entrepreneurs, do to somehow try to improve our level of economic freedom in a country that have massive regulations, massive taxes, and where you have a serious problem of very bad, poor management of the public thing by the government?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is one of those questions that I don't know if I can say what exactly you should do, other than to say you can't give up, which I think is key. But I also think it's about, as an entrepreneur, I mean, what do entrepreneurs trying to do? They're trying to provide a service or a good to people. And I think you do have to be willing to relocate. I'm not saying outside of the country, but perhaps to a different part of the country, because I bet, my suspicion is that the regulations are different in different areas, perhaps the corruption levels are different in different areas. So if you really feel that you're called to be here, then I think you should try to find out where you can be here and survive, the best. But I also think we meaning everyone, need to be vocal agitators for economic freedom. Mm-hmm. Because this idea of economic freedom, I mean, economists know what it is, but the world doesn't talk in this language. And I think every one of us can change that. I think we need to agitate and be public and be open and use social media and just agitate for more economic freedom and hold people responsible. I think that's a longer game. It takes longer to change that. But I still think it's absolutely necessary.
Here's a quick one. Português first. Hoje é o aniversário de Friedrich Hayek, dos mais importantes economistas na escola austríaca, mas em Brasil o Mises é muito mais conhecido, Van Mises é muito mais conhecido. Qual dos dois você acha, na sua opinião, que teve um impacto mais importante para a nossa conceituação de economia? Today is Friedrich Hayek's birthday, and he would be one of the most important economists within the Austrian tradition. But in Brazil, Van Mises is much more, he's better known, and people talk much more about him. In your own personal opinion, which one of those two do you think has contributed more, and why?
Oh, what a great question. Well, I think that you would not have a Hayek without Mises, for certain. Hayek was Mises' student. I think the difference is that Mises was really carving new territory intellectually. If you read his book Human Action, which is about 1,000 pages, it's not an easy read at all, but he starts with praxeology and epistemology and these ideas, of the human person. So he very much is laying a very firm and fertile foundation for economics to head into the future. I think what is different about Hayek, and maybe why he's liked in more places than others, is Hayek in some way took his ideas to the policy world in a more direct way. Mm-hmm. So Hayek writes The Road to Serfdom, which is really about the rise of fascism in the 20th century, and as kind of a warning. And he was very influential with people like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. So I just wonder if it's the student became more popular than the teacher because the student was able to popularize in some ways that maybe Mises didn't or wouldn't.
Yeah. I think that his whole argument of demarchy as the transcendental rooting for the rest is no one hit a better ball than that one.
Yeah.
Here's a question. It sort of extends this issue, but with a more practical concern. How do we reconcile our pursuit of flourishing and our idea of what a good life, or what shalom would be, the idea of economic freedom? How do we reconcile that with the fact that indeed in policy making and in government, in social theory, in much of political theory. There's a pervading paternalistic kind of bent that seems to assume that the limited capability of individuals says that it should be left to someone else or to an aggregate, all the decision making. These are two very different tendencies.
Yeah, so if I understand the question, I think what it's saying is how do we reconcile the current modern tendencies towards paternalism with this idea of shalom? It's a really quite a thoughtful question, I think, because if you think about what Scripture is advocating with shalom, it's certainly not this idea of the rugged individualist who does whatever they want and has full license. And by the way, I don't think the Austrians were advocating for that. I don't think, kind of libertarians with a small L are necessarily advocating, or classical liberals are advocating for that. So I think there's a misrepresentation, perhaps, of some of that. But I do think in shalom, you are going to be watching out for your neighbor. You are going to be caring for them. I think the distinction is you don't use coercion to do so. Or you don't, that's not your first reaction. Whereas as I think about modern paternalism, it's almost always a reach for the state first to solve problems. So this is just a very short, I'll keep it short, example. In the United States, I have 2 small children, so I have a 7-year-old and a 3-year-old. And if I take them, when I get home, to the dry cleaners, and I pull up in front of the dry cleaners and I walk inside, the car is parked right in front of the door. I can see my car. It's 72 degrees outside. The windows are down, all this kind of stuff. It's a very good chance that I'll get arrested for leaving my kids in the car while I go for 3 minutes to pick up the dry cleaning. This is kind of a new thing in the U.S. Maybe other places, but I don't know as much. Anyway, it is crazy to me that if my neighbor is worried about my children, it seems like the first response would be, let me wait with your kids outside the car till you get out and say something to you directly. But what actually is happening is it's kind of cowardly. It's, I'm going to call the police and leave, and then you're going to get arrested. So there's this paternalism that's not driven by love for our neighbor. It's driven by, I don't know what. I want to use the state to tell you what to do because you should be doing what I do.
Self-righteousness, maybe?
Yeah, self-righteousness, yeah. All the wrong things.
Legalism.
Envy.
Here's a good one. How do we keep remembering that shalom demands stewardship? Stewardship means we do not chase profits at the expense of the well-being of everyone, and environmental issues and issues of greed guiding companies that will take risks that affect everyone.
Yeah. I think what we have to keep in mind is that first and foremost, we are fallen, sinful human beings, every single one of us. Every single one of us has the propensity to greed. The question is, what keeps you from acting on that greed? And I think this is where we have to have this bigger conversation about the institutions of a society. So if the institutions support entrepreneurship, entrepreneurship is always going to pursue profit. That's the only way it works. Prices, profits, and loss, right? I mean, profits are given to the business by the customers, so that's a good thing. But I think it's when you have these weak or poor institutions of the rule of law, property rights, corruption, then what happens is you start using the state to exploit. So I like to call this cronyism or statism. Some people call it crony capitalism. I don't love that saying, but it's okay. It's the same idea, which is that these larger corporations who have big, fancy lawyers and a lot of capital, they use the state to manipulate the system, and usually what they're doing is trying to keep their competitors out. So that's kind of institutionalized greed. So I think that conversation is all about the institutions. It's not necessarily about changing human beings, because we can't do that, but it's taking them on their worst day and trying to figure out how most of them are going to wake up and think about serving strangers, not plundering them.
It's interesting that you mentioned statism, because some time ago I heard a very interesting story where in the early 80s, R.C. Spruce shared a cab with Francis Schaeffer and asked him, what do you think is the biggest, said, well, you've done pretty well predicting the great evangelical disaster and all of that. What do you think is the greatest threat we're going to face for the next century? And according to Spruce, Schaeffer said statism.
He was right.
Okay, this question refers not so much to the main thrust of what you talked today, but previous work that you've done. As a Christian and economist, could you give us what is your perspective in terms of the plan that God has for each one, and at the same time the fact that economic inequality and the levels of poverty can basically lock people into something which they can't leave.
Oh yeah, this is such an
trap.
Yeah, this is an important question, and it's been occupying a lot of my research, this idea of inequality and how Christians are to deal with this issue. So I think the question was right to start with, we all have a unique purpose that only we can fulfill. And I think it's very clear that we have an obligation to help people live into that if they're able. We have an obligation to our fellow human beings to help them. And so that then begs the question of, well, what's holding them back? And so this is where we get into what I think needs to be a nuanced conversation on inequality. Inequality can be a good thing, and I know that might not sound crazy, but usually in a market society where somebody's going to come up with an idea that nobody had before, they're going to become very rich potentially. I mean, for example, I would very much appreciate if somebody could develop a cure for any type of cancer. And I would hope that that person would get a lot of profit by thinking those things and developing those things. So inequality isn't bad. What's bad is, as the question mentioned, if you're stuck in the bottom.
Right.
So really what I think we need to talk about is not so much inequality. Inequality deals with the income gap differences between the richest and the poorest. What we need to talk about is mobility. So what does it look like to be poor, and what does it take to not be poor anymore? Those are the real questions. Because, I mean, for example, you know, when I started working as a teenager, I made the minimum wage, you know. But I was living in my parents' house, and it was fine. But it was very important for my career to get my foot on the economic ladder, if you will. The question is, I didn't stay there, right? I got to go to college, I got to go to graduate school, I got to pursue all these opportunities. There are some people in different societies, some are worse than others, where you're born at the bottom and you stay at the bottom. And that's where I think if you do a correlation between the societies that have the worst type of inequality, you also find that they have the lowest levels of economic freedom. So I think economic freedom is very correlated with a lack of income mobility for the poor, and it keeps them trapped. And so that's a real, again, I think it comes back to an institutional question as to how we're going to fix it. So anyway, I could talk all day about that, sorry.
That's very good. Ok, o nosso tempo basicamente acabou. Já passou um pouquinho, time's up. So, mas antes de procedermos à nossa finalização, uma pergunta só. Our time is up, but I'll stretch it for a very brief moment for one question that I think in the end is fun and is in the mind of every Brazilian here.
Okay.
It's a little play on prognosis, or predicting the future even. There have been positive impacts, maybe some negative impacts also, but of a shift that's happening in Brazil towards, for lack of a better word, more liberal ideas in terms of market and economics. The U.S. also seems to be experiencing that swing in some things. That's the question put here. And there's some things in Brazil that have been done very recently that have been controversial, but one of them is the flexibilization of labor relations, honoring the agreement between employer and employees over and above a very strict set of regulations. How long would you say it would take for these things to either take effect or for us to get an idea if they're working or not? And I know it's a very subjective part, but...
Well, it's funny. People always ask economists to predict the future, so we just have to wing it sometimes. You know, here, let me give you an example from the United States, just from some perspective. In 2000, the United States was ranked number 2 in the world in economic freedom, so second best. Today, it's 16, 17. So every year we've dropped a ranking. And so the question really is, you know, does that matter for most Americans? Do they feel the pinch? And I think it depends on in what areas. Some can hurt people faster than others. So I would say part of it, if there's positive reforms, I think you can see a very quick response. And here's one. It's not, at least theoretically, hard to pull back regulations. From a public choice perspective, it's hard. But if you have somebody who's willing to say, I'm going to dismantle all these regulations that make it hard for small businesses to start, then if those go away tomorrow, you're going to see growth. You're going to see some positive changes. I think some things that can be harder is when you have to change the values of a society. You know, and I use a very extreme example, but modern day Afghanistan, right? So the United States and many other countries we've been in Afghanistan year after year after year after year, trying to establish a democracy, trying to establish property rights. Well, this is hard, and it really has not proven to work very well. Why? I think because people have to believe in democracy to want it. You can't force them to want it. People have to believe in respecting property rights. So there's a culture shift that has to happen before a legal shift is ever going to take hold. But it sounds like what you've just said, you're actually working in the right direction. If the cultural attitudes and values are towards, you know, respecting people's property and towards liberalism, then that is actually going to go a long way, I think, to drive reforms that you'll see. But I still think some reforms occur faster than others.
Yes.
Inflation. If the government stops inflating tomorrow, guess what? The money will be sound and the economy will pick up pretty quickly. So some things you can change overnight. Those tend to be the ones where the people with authority don't want to change them. So it's a double-edged sword, I suppose.
It is. Thank you.
Thank you so much.